James Jackson, and welcome to another episode of Mad in Germany. In this episode, I spoke with expert in international law Matthias Goldmann about how the Staatsräson and German support of Israel may be undermining the very concept of international law itself. This conversation took place a few weeks ago, and events have already overtaken it, with Annalena Baerbock's support for Israel's bombing of hospitals, as well as many other cases. But there's still so much interesting information about the rule of law and how Germany is undermining it with its suppression of pro-Palestinian protests and complete support for Israel no matter what in this episode. So I hope you enjoy it. Stay tuned and stay mad.
This time joined by Matthias Goldmann, a professor of international law at EBS University and also associated with the Max Planck Center for International Law in Heidelberg. Matthias has been one of the leading voices in covering the curious way in which Germany has been dealing with the law around Palestine, international law. So we're really honored to have him here today and to talk about what is going on, what is legal, what is the rule of law, and how the Staatsräson also fits into this. So, hi, Matthias.
Hi, James. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, I'm interested to hear your take on law and international law in the last 10 months since October the 7th in Germany, how this is relating to Germany's support for Israel, how this is relating to censorship, the BDS-Beschluss. So we've got quite broad topics to talk about, as well as recent attacks in Lebanon. Do you see a wider trend of the law being used to stifle freedom of speech in Germany in the last 10, 11 months?
I do see that, definitely. Even though one has really to add some nuances here, because I think, overall, German courts are doing a really good job. German courts really have not lost or are even gaining the capacity to differentiate and to look at the context in which something is presented and to distinguish statements on that basis and to see and really to fully grasp a message. And so many of the bans of demonstrations and etc. have been lifted later on, and many criminal sanctions didn't get imposed after all, or were reversed in the second instance. So courts are doing a proper job. But you see that the courts only come second. Mm-hmm. What comes first is state action that prohibits assemblies, that prohibits certain kinds of speech, that takes away funding, that disinvites people. I mean, universities are also part of the state in Germany, and there were people getting uninvited and getting cancelled. And that, of course, in itself, very often is a limitation on speech. Now, of course, we have to talk about the limits of speech. We have to talk about the limits of the freedom of association. But our constitution allows quite a lot. It even allows, opinions that some people might consider offensive or shocking, as long as it's not in violation of, some fundamental values like human dignity.
So I have a question. The German constitution does, of course, allow for freedom of speech. I think some people have questions about how this is applied by the state, because there's one thing that we see increasingly. We see police violence at pro-Palestine demonstrations, often against women and children. And then we see neo-Nazis going around chanting Ost, Ost, Ostdeutschland at queer pride parades. So why is it that certain types of speech here are banned and some aren't? And of course, Germany's legal structure came about as a result of the Second World War and the Nazi dictatorship. So for me, it's quite curious why the state is somehow quite lax against policing neo-Nazi demonstrations. I've seen videos of someone walking around with a T-shirt that says swastika Hakenkreuz on it, unmolested by police. But then if you wear a keffiyeh in Berlin, this is partly a Berlin-specific problem. If you wear a keffiyeh on your head, the police can say it's on your face. You can be quite violently arrested. So, why is that? Why is this kind of double standards policing happening?
So, so you're implying that the police does apply double standards. I guess that one can hold that view.
Seems to.
Yeah, it seems to. It seems to. Yeah, one would really. It's difficult without quantitative data to say so. But at least what we can say is that the problem is also the police is not uniform. There's like 16 states that have a separate police organization. There is a federal police, like the responsible for border and for security in on trains, for example, and all of them might apply different standards and have different approaches. So it's really difficult to say that at a general level. But I would share the impression that there is a very problematic way of imposing restrictions, in particular on solidarity, on any sign of solidarity with Palestine. I would not necessarily share the impression that the police is always lenient on right-wing extremism. We have had cases of that. So there were some groups in the police that clearly showed a sympathy with Nazism or with neo-Nazis, and unfortunately some of them also were seen as being involved in problematic ways in certain activities. That extends not only to East Germany but also to West Germany. Like Hessen has had a group of police officers that were entertaining a chat group where lots of Nazi talk came up. And I think it hasn't really properly sanctioned that yet. So there is a problem of the police being lenient on.
But not just police, the law. So, for example, bans. So this question of which demos are allowed and which ones are banned, right?
Absolutely, yeah, definitely. So there, as I say, I wouldn't say that you can generalize the position that the police is always lenient on neo-Nazis. Some of them clearly have double standards. Others of them are not as they're doing a proper job in fighting right-wing extremism. I would say it like that. But what you clearly can say that is this tendency to be extremely strict if it comes to Gaza, and overly strict and in a way that is not in conformity with the constitution. We've seen that, for example, with the Palestine Congress here in Berlin. Now, think about that politically, what you want, but it's clear that all the reasons for closing it down somehow were fabricated. Yeah, they were kind of creating their own reason in that they were prohibiting a person from entering the country and from speaking in Germany, like specifically at short notice, without that person knowing, in order to have a reason to close it down. It almost seemed like that.
And that's illegal.
I would say that's the prohibitions as such were untenable. Some of them have been quashed. Meanwhile, because if it's an EU citizen like Varoufakis, they enjoy free speech. If it's a foreigner, the restrictions on free speech also have to be respected to a lesser extent. But still, I think what is at stake here is the free speech of the people here who want to invite that person. And so in that regard, the difference is not that big after all. And even there, I think one could say that it was unconstitutional what has happened. And therefore, the prohibition of the assembly of this Congress based on people speaking there that shouldn't be speaking could not be entertained. So that's quite an outrageous example for an overreach of government. And the same goes with many assemblies that were prohibited, for example, because some people said from the river to the sea or showed signs with that. And the state had the police and the local municipalities had often a very crude way of approaching that. They were not able to understand that you have to contextualize that very often that is just a political statement on the Middle East, and that it's not necessarily associated with Hamas. But it could also mean, we're in favor of a one-state solution. Well, think about that what you want, but it doesn't mean that we want to eliminate Jews living in Israel-Palestine. Absolutely not. Yeah.
And I have a question about the legality of the bans on From the River to the Sea, which has been overturned by the court in multiple instances, but we still keep seeing these bans being used. Why is that? If that's been ruled legal in, let's say, the Mannheim court, I mean, how does German law work on this? A lot of our audience might not be legal experts.
Yeah. So unfortunately, there has not been any judgment of the Constitutional Court on that issue. That will still take a while. I suppose that we will see some as we go along. So that's one of the problems. Many of the decisions right now, they have been taken by courts at the lower instance, and that is not really relevant for other courts, that aren't subordinate to them, or some decisions have been taken by criminal courts. Now, an administrative court can take a different view. Second problem is that all of these court decisions, they deal with one single case. And of course, courts have to differentiate. No situation is like another. So I wouldn't say that you can generally say that From the River to the Sea is always unproblematic. Depending on the context.
Isn't it free speech, though?
Yeah. Well, depending on the context, it's at least in theory, you can think of contexts where that would be a call to eliminate Jews in Israel. It could be that, but you have to make the case. You have to show that in that specific instance, it could only be understood in that way. If it can be understood in different ways, then the Constitution, free speech, as you say, requires that we give that person the benefit of the doubt. That we, in case of doubt, we give preference to freedom, and therefore one has to be very careful. And our police and municipal authorities are not careful enough.
I want to come back to this question in a sec, but first, what consequences are there in the German system if courts are, arguably, if the police rather and the states are arguably systematically oppressing people's rights? They might sue, they might have the criminal proceedings against them dropped, but can they get any recourse? And is there any way to stop this from happening again and again? Because I keep seeing, activists being charged for often incitement to racial hatred because of a pro-Palestine slogan, sometimes being a member of a terrorist organization. In a couple of cases, there have been raids on their house. And so then the cases are dropped because, as you said, the German courts are often doing a solid job and there's not really much of a legal case against them. But how can law stop these kind of possibly problematic actions?
It's very difficult to do that preventively. I mean, you can get a judgment on a specific prohibition and challenge that. But if there is no specific prohibition, then there is very little that you can do preventively. You can't force them to act in a certain way in a situation that doesn't exist yet, that we don't fully know yet whether it exists. The only thing that you can do in that respect is, to rally support for your position and perhaps get get that case going. Try to get a very clear statement of higher ranking courts that might make an impression on politics. And the other thing is that you really have to go the political way. There should be commissions of inquiry into the operation of at least certain authorities. I think that Berlin is clearly a case for that.
Because Berlin has been particularly strict on the, arguably oppression of the pro-Palestine movement.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's TV footage where people showing just the Palestine flag were arrested for that, or it was prohibited to them to show a flag, and that flag is flying in front of the UN headquarters on First Avenue in New York. So, I mean, that is really taking it too far. Just showing that flag can mean many, many things, and most of them are fully legal. And therefore, of course, this is an instance of free speech. You might not like it, but it's free speech.
I mean, there were also cases after the 7th October directly where the keffiyeh was not allowed in all Berlin schools, of course, a symbol of Palestinian solidarity and also, national culture. And then there were so-called pauschale Verbote, like blanket bans on all Palestine solidarity after that. I mean, Amnesty International and Amnesty Germany were both very clear in condemning that. But how can you condemn are blanket bans on demonstrations legal?
For demonstrations, I would consider that as very problematic. Again, because each speech act, each statement, each sign, each symbol has to be evaluated in its context. And unless you can clearly associate a certain statement or a symbol with, let's say, Hamas, and with Hamas in a problematic way.
Yeah. If there was like a Hamas salute, like there is a Hitler salute.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. That unless that is the case, it would be very difficult to prohibit it, because you always have to make a decision in an individual case. So very much of that really depends on the leading police officers. What is their policy? How do they handle it? What instructions do they give? Yeah.
But is it just police, or is it also political? I mean, there's many cases where the Palestine Congress, as you mentioned, where instructions came not just from the police but from ministries.
It seems to be the case indeed. And as I say, that would be a case for a political inquiry in how those situations are handled. So absolutely, you have to go both roads. You have to pursue legal recourse and try to get investigations going at the political level.
Okay. And so I wanted to go back to your point before about from the river to the sea. Now, I've done some reporting on this issue where I've talked to state prosecutors about a statement about a one-state solution where all of the Arabs should be kicked out of Israel. They said that is not illegal because there's no inland Bezug. It's not Volksverhetzung, it's not incitement to racial hatred, because there is no people in Germany affected by that. This is also, as far as I understand, why the former IDF spokesperson Arya Shalikar hasn't been charged, or the criminal proceedings against him were dropped. So why is it legal, according to state prosecutors, to say Arabs driven out of Israel into the neighboring states, but it's not illegal to say that about Israelis? Obviously, Israeli Jews. Obviously, we would never say that, but.
So the criminal law in question here is the prohibition of Volksverhetzung, which means like public incitement to let's say to public uproar or something like that. That's a random translation. I would have to Google translate that.
Yeah, I've heard it as incitement to racial hatred.
Yeah, incitement to racial hatred probably is very fitting. So the question is always, why do we punish that? Because of course, obviously, it has a problematic relationship with free speech. Now, the point is that the reason it is punished is because it might lead here to conflicts in Germany. Yeah. So the question is really, is a certain statement that was uttered at a specific moment, that was made at a specific moment, in a specific situation, to a specific audience, in a position to lead to conflicts here. And that could be the case if it's made at a demonstration in Germany, at a public event in Germany, because there could be a certain risk that it incites violence. Whereas if you make it on
Twitter,
the internet,
for example,
it could be very different. Yeah. So there has to be an actual risk of things turning violent. That's why we prohibit certain kinds of speech. It's not because something is racist. If something is racist, it might be despicable, it might be objectionable, it might be disgusting, but unfortunately, free speech protects a lot of things. even speech that we find offensive, unless it's really a violation of human dignity. But that is a limit that is that takes a lot to reach. Yeah. So some forms of forms of anti-Semitic speech could even fall under the protection of free speech, and only if there is a concrete risk that it will give rise to a violent incident, it's subject to criminal sanctions. So I think there are ways of distinguishing it. Yeah, it doesn't necessarily mean double standards, although one would have to look at individual cases with some detail, some time.
Okay, that's a really interesting point. So, for example, theoretically, if someone went to a pro-Israel demonstration or a counter demonstration of a Palestine one, and they chanted this song that's very popular in Israel, "May Your Village Burn," that could quite possibly,
Absolutely, yeah,
yeah. So I also want to pick up on another point of criminal law. Now, the Palestine Solidarity Network, Duisburg, were completely banned. We talked about this previously. And I thought the legal justification for this was very curious. There's this German word, Völkerverständigung, which means like the peace between people, which to me sounds, quite hippie almost. But it's actually got some anchoring in German law. And as I understand it, if your club is against the peace between peoples, then it can be banned like that by the ministry.
So that's correct. However, I have to add that this provision, which you referred to, Völkerverständigung, peace between peoples, needs to be read in light of fundamental rights, including free speech and freedom of association, which is at stake here. And that requires giving it a very narrow reading. So it is only acceptable to prohibit a association if it really fundamentally endangers that like worldwide peace in a specific way. And that would mean if they, for example, advocate acts that are not only against international law, but also in a violent way. Yeah, so it has to be kind of a gross violation of international law, kind of a disrespect for international rules, for international peace, that only would give rise to a prohibition.
But so, for example, in the Gaza context, right, I've seen plenty of people advocating for the annexation of Gaza by Israel, which would be ethnic cleansing on a massive scale, right? So I don't think we're going to see the Deutsche Israelische Gesellschaft being banned under Vereinsrecht, are we here? So
even though they also probably made a negative contribution to worldwide peace, by having manifestations under a flag of Israel that comprised the occupied territories, the occupied Palestinian territories, which is a very an obvious violation of international law.
And we've seen that a lot recently. We've even seen an ex-minister, Julia Klöckner, and anti-Semitism commissioners. So why is that not against this rule on Völkerverständigung?
So I don't think you can ban the German-Israeli association just because there might be some problematic statements, there might be some problematic images, but it nowhere reaches really the limit where it would be kind of a gross violent violation of international law. However, in case of the specific association, Palestine Solidarity
Duisburg,
Duisburg, I also see in that lengthy decision of the authorities, I see a lot of a lot of evidence that is collected that that is not really poignant, that is not really relevant. Yeah, so they collect a lot of statements and programmatic points of the platform of that association, which you might disagree with. Some of it you might even classify as being at least at a subtle level anti-Semitic, but that is clearly not enough to prohibit it. Mm-hmm. Yeah, as I said, the limits of free speech are very wide. It also comprises statements that we don't like, that we find objectionable. And I see a lot of stuff that falls into a gray area. There's very little in that lengthy decision where you would really say that this is super problematic. So, for example, to say from the river to the sea in a specific context and with reference to the 7th of October. But then, that only happened once. There's like one piece of evidence that I have. And is that really enough to prohibit an association when all the rest is, maybe problematic, maybe, for some people, not the kind of opinions they would like to hear, but overall still probably covered by free speech, also because it's subject to different interpretations. Yeah, I think it's a case of overreach, and I'm looking forward to see that case, or to see that decision being challenged in courts. It has already been challenged, but it has to be reviewed by a court. And I would I suppose that it's going to be very difficult for the government to maintain it, because if we really apply the standard that we apply for free speech cases in this situation, which formally doesn't fall under free speech, but the freedom of association. But if we apply somehow the same or equivalent standards, I think that most of the evidence collapses.
And so, how would you categorize Germany's response, or the state authorities' response? Would you say what we've seen in the last 10 months is unprecedented? Have you ever seen German law being used in this way against, in such a political way?
In my lifetime, haven't seen that. But I haven't lived through, the 1970s, with the RAF and with this kind of German version of McCarthyism, where, lots of controls were imposed on people that wanted to become civil servants, public employees, for example, teachers. They had to undergo a kind of a critical examination of their loyalty to the Constitution, which has remained in force ever since. And
in that, you were not allowed to be a member of the Communist Party, for example, and this was actually brought in under the Social Democrats. So there's a very good essay about this in Jacobin magazine by Leandros Fischer, who said that, for the Social Democrats, the Wahrhafte Demokratie, the defense of democracy that Germany conceives itself as having after the Nazi dictatorship, has actually always meant a strong state that has more ability to interfere in politics and political groupings than in maybe other comparable states like France or the UK.
Absolutely. That is definitely the case. Even our intelligence services are set up in that way. I mean, we've got this intelligence service called Verfassungsschutz, Constitutional Protection Agency, so to say. And there's this wonderful book by Ronen Steinke where he elaborates the operation of that that agency and shows how ultimately it is meant to control political communication and how much that is subject to the preferences of those in power, because someone has to give them instructions. It's not meant to be completely independent, and you can show, and he really shows how selective it was in the political speech it observed. It marked as problematic in how how easily you get under its focus when you oppose capitalism, which is not in the Constitution. Yeah, I mean, there's the right to property in the Constitution, but that doesn't mean capitalism. Yeah, and so how it quickly overreaches, and that is part of this idea of militant democracy. So Germany indeed has a very administrative way of trying to defend democracy, which is, I think, somehow in the German public culture anyway. If there is a problem in Germany, we normally try to find an administrative solution. So sometimes that helps, if it's really a welfare problem, it can be a solution. But very often, if it's a problem of political culture and a discourse and a democracy, it can also be super negative, because it just restricts our it blinkers our political discourse.
I mean, arguably, it's a bit of a paradox, right? The response to a totalitarian regime was that we need a really strong state. I mean, this isn't quite embracing liberalism as you might expect it to. Not to say that there aren't some positive points there as well.
And the problem is that right now we see how weak it is when democracy is actually challenged. So we don't have a prohibition of the AfD, even though, even the Constitutional Protection Agency says that in some specific areas, in some specific groupings, Thuringia and Saxony, it clearly is anti-constitutional. It wants to change the regime. And still we don't get to grips with it. So what is it worth? What's the added value? It shows that this is not enough. You need kind of political resilience that comes from people's hearts and minds.
Yeah, you can't have the state just banning everything. Otherwise, what you might see, because the state is made up of people, it represents a culture. In a culture where, for example, solidarity with Palestine is highly problematized, that will then be banned by the state. Yeah. Whereas, right-wing extremism, it's arguably more normalized actually than solidarity with Palestine, with about 20% of the German population voting for the AfD, maybe a bit less at the moment, but far more in Eastern Germany.
Of course, and the whole administrative state apparatus to protect democracy becomes super problematic as soon as you get into the situation where a right-wing extremist party gets control over the state. If only indirectly, it could be that a government kind of depends on their approval, at least for some questions, where they need a larger majority.
The so-called Sperrminorität, which that means that effectively constitutional judges cannot be appointed in Thuringia now because there is a two-thirds, they don't have a two-thirds majority in parliament without the AfD.
Or changes to the constitution.
So I want to look at one particular term which is quasi-legal, and that is Staatsräson, right? So this is something which has kind of defined Germany's relationship to Israel, at least for the last 16 or so years. Where does this fit into the legal sphere? And do you see a danger of the Staatsräson being in conflict with the Rechtsstaat? So the reason of state being in conflict with the rule of law?
Absolutely. So the peculiarity about Staatsräson is that it's not a legal concept. It's not a constitutional concept. There are constitutional principles, but that is not a constitutional principle. It's actually a government policy. It's a policy that was developed by Chancellor Merkel on her visit to Israel, I think a couple of years ago, like
2008.
It has been referenced by the parliament in the BDS resolution from 2019, but that's also a policy. So it only sits at the level of policy. Still, policies can be influential because policies can influence what state authorities are doing, how they're understanding their policy tools. For example, to ban a association, to ban a demonstration, to take action and to bring criminal charges. And so it has a big indirect influence in many decisions prohibiting pro-Palestine activities. That for the BDS resolution that evokes Staatsräson was invoked. So it has an indirect influence. However, you can't challenge it legally because it's not a legal concept. So this is kind of a catch-22, right? And from the point of view of the rule of law, it's of course highly problematic.
So I have a hot take on this, what you call the catch-22. Is there something similar to the state of exception about the Staatsräson? Is it an almost Schmittian concept in that it stands outside of the rule of law, but it's no longer governed by the rule of law?
It's very tempting to go in that direction. I wouldn't say so, because even nowadays the state of exception is, kind of governed by the rule of law. And we would always consider the constitution, and that includes fundamental rights, as superior to any of these notions, be it state of exception or be it Staatsräson. So ultimately, of course, if you complain about the decision based on Staatsräson,
You're doing it in a framework of the rule of law.
Exactly, and you can win the case. The problem is only that it takes time, it takes effort, it takes resources, it takes nerves to to go to courts and to fight for your right. And in that respect, it really makes life difficult for people holding certain opinions, and that burden is unevenly distributed.
Absolutely. And, talking about the state getting involved in ways which are sometimes quite hidden and you don't have much recourse to, there's of course been a slow burn scandal for the last 6 months, of which you yourself have commented on, the so-called Fördergeldaffäre. Now, in this, the Education Ministry federally was found to be putting together lists of people, of university lecturers, which then which had supported free speech on campus, pro-Palestine, the right to do pro-Palestine demonstrations on campus, and then the Ministry of Education was putting together lists to make them no longer eligible for public funding. And this is something which, could have been, arguably should have been a resigning offence for the minister, and her state secretary resigned and made some comments that implied it wasn't her decision, right? So what do you think about this? Is there any chance that this could be the end of the German education minister, Bettina Stark-Watzinger? Or is it legal for if I remember rightly, they were told, there was a leaked email that says it's illegal for me to put together this list, but I'll do it anyway. I'll do it ungladly.
Yeah. So far, we don't really know for sure what happened in the internal operations. Some emails or some communication has been leaked, and it seems that first they were aware of the explosive character of what they were doing. Second, it seems that they were trying to do it anyway, but we don't exactly know who ordered it. If that will come out, I think it will be politically impossible for the minister to stay in office. I think even within the coalition that would no longer work.
But it might not come out.
It might not come out, indeed. What could bring it to light would be a parliamentary inquiry commission, because they have different rights of investigations. They can investigate things like a court. They can simply order certain files that have not been made public yet. And we know that there are a lot of files because the state secretary that was fired said that she put everything into, on the record. She placed everything on the record.
But is there enough time left in this government for that to happen?
That is not the question. The question is whether there's a political desire to do so. And what you can see is that the current coalition just wants to survive. So I think there's very few people who really want to go into that.
But what was their motivation?
The opposition. I mean, you don't need a majority for a commission of inquiry. But I'm not even sure if the opposition wants it.
Because it's this Palestine topic, right, which is so explosive in German politics that even when it's possibly against the rule of law, people don't want to be seen to be on the side of it. And so we've spoken so far mostly about Germany. I'd actually but you are a lecturer in international law. Of course, Germany has its positions on international law. I don't know, have you seen the BPK recently about the International Court of Justice, the International Court of Justice? There was a question by the journalist Thilo Jung about where Germany stands on the Israeli occupation, and in that the press spokesperson of the government said, they say that Israel has to leave the occupied territories as soon as possible. That means after negotiations. And then Thilo Jung actually corrected him to say it says without negotiation. So, what has Germany's reaction to the International Court of Justice ruling on Palestine been like? Because in some ways, this was a completely seminal ruling that changed the game, but it barely got klein geredet in in Germany. It got barely talked about. What do you think about that?
Yeah. It's a statement that is not fully in line with the content of the advisory opinion. The advisory opinion says that you need to that Israel is under an obligation to end occupation as soon as possible. And if anyone has to decide about the modalities, it's not negotiations, but it's the UN. And recently, the UN actually made a statement that said that, like, within 1 year, it has to be over. So that is the situation under international law. I think it's relatively clear in that regard, and Germany tries to give that a reading which is not in conformity with international law, which I find very unfortunate because reliance on international law has been very fundamental for Germany's self-understanding ever since. Well, probably since 1945, but at least since 1990. Also for the reason that Germany, on the one hand, crucially relies on transatlantic support for its security. On the other hand, that of course very often brings you in trouble. And then how do you balance that? On the one hand, being showing solidarity with the United States. On the other hand, maybe you don't want to go into every war. So you rely on international law. That used to be, I would say, a prudent strategy. But then, of course, the question is always, what do you understand as international law? And there, I would say that Germany's reading has never been unproblematic. There were problematic instances before. Now we can talk about the Kosovo War. We can talk about the attack on or the apprehension of Osama bin Laden, which we might applaud, but legally
quite novel.
It was quite unlawful, yeah, and. So it wouldn't be the first time that Germany tries to bend the rule of law in a way that I would consider highly problematic, and that I would consider resemblant of the rules-based international order, which is kind of the American way of talking about international law, because rules-based means that it's actually only the rules that we committed to. We're not understanding international law as a coherent system necessarily, but a system of individual specific rules that we choose a la carte as we like. So in cherry picking.
So in this case, it would be America not signing up to the ICC, the International Criminal Court, and they actually have a bill which is unofficially called the Bomb the Hague Bill, where they say if any American citizen is ever called to the Hague, they will simply bomb it. So that's the.
But it's an approach to the rule of law that is not necessarily unique to America, or to the United States of America, but that is, I think, typical of a hegemonic or quasi-hegemonic or just a very powerful state and sort of an empire. And I think empires can afford to do that. Germany can't.
And why should it want to as well? If German self-perception is based based on following the rules of law, it's something and human rights are considered to be extremely important here. People have even called Germany the human rights superpower. So I think what makes this case of extreme support of Israel novel, unlike Kosovo, is that rather than supporting human rights and arguably breaking international law, they're breaking human rights and international law.
So the reason why Germany is taking that position is unfinished business from the past. So the deal, so to say, in relations between Germany and Israel, but also Germany and the international community, or at least the Western Hemisphere, for a very long time has been that Germany is supporting Israel, and that kind of rehabilitates Germany. That was initially a deal that also had many economic consequences. There has been a lot of research on how Germany aided the industrialization of Israel in the past. And I think much of that is fine and is not to be criticized. But of course, it gets problematic at the point where the Israeli government is just in blatant violation of international law, which it has been with respect to the occupied Palestine territories. And at that point, I think Germany really needs to reorient itself, and that really would require a revisiting our memory culture in on a bigger scale, which we haven't done yet. And that, I think, you can see in many different contexts. For example, in the context of our colonial past, we made some advances there, even under the present government. For example, some pieces of looted art were restituted. So there is some progress, but still, overall, there's so many open issues. The reparation issues with Namibia is going nowhere. And so if you still have a kind of a post Second World War idea of your global position, how would you expect us to get to a new understanding and to see that you need to look at more than just two actors, that you actually need to look at the whole world and how they will judge your position.
So Germany's memory culture has been accused of focusing on the crimes of the Holocaust, the annihilation of the Jews, and excluding many of the other genocides that Germany was involved with, especially the Herero and Nama, the first genocide of the 20th century. How come memory culture hasn't really engaged with that?
We were never forced to get to grips with the other Holocausts, with the other genocides. After the Second World War, Germany was in shambles, and it had to take some action, and paying reparations, or paying Wiedergutmachung, as it was called, like
make it good again.
Make it good again was part of the game of getting back, and also being a democracy was extremely important also for in the context of the emerging Cold War. So there were I would say insurmountable hurdles to continue as before, and absolutely compelling reasons to get to grips with the Holocaust. Still, it was a very, very tough road. We don't have to forget that. And up until this day, there are many things that we still haven't fixed yet. There's still groups, that haven't been compensated. There's still pieces of art that haven't been restored. So it's absolutely not the case that the Holocaust, the Holocaust reparations efforts are over or are sufficient. So I would say that that just shows how difficult it is if you're not in a situation where you absolutely have to do that. After the First World War, when Germany lost its colonies, there was no interest at the international level for it to, kind of recognize what it did, because there were still so many colonial powers, and some of them were ever so happy to take over from Germany. So it's not shifting the blame to the others, but also, how could that ever be revisited without any internal or external reason for doing so?
And of course, the Genocide Convention hadn't been set up by that
Hadn't
point.
been adopted, yeah. And even after its adoption, it was considered to apply only to, basically to the Holocaust, maybe to some other genocides. So, for example, in 2015, Germany recognized the Armenian genocide. And then only it occurred to some that maybe that's not a good idea, as long as you haven't revisited your own colonial history or your own history of that period. So there was absolute amnesia, yeah, like there is amnesia in most former colonial powers.
And has Germany recognized the Nama and Herero genocide as such?
So meanwhile, many government institutions have given recognition to that. So even in 2015, there was a speech by the president of the parliament, of the Bundestag at that time, who recognized it. The president has recognized it. So there is big recognition of that fact, and there have been some restitutions, for example, of Hendrik Witboy's Bible and Whip. Hendrik Witboy was one of the leaders of the Nama movement, and there have been talks about reparation, but they haven't succeeded yet. So there's still a lot to be done, and there is also we also still need to overcome this prioritization where the groups from Namibia, in that case, get the impression that they're kind of second-rate victims. And you can see that in many respects, like, for example, how our memory culture works. We don't yet have a place to commemorate what happened during colonialism. And some street names have been changed at least, and some of them have been given names of resistance fighters or people that contributed to resistance. And but still, we're pretty much at the beginning here. If you handle international law,
right, and so effectively you're saying that Germany wants to be seen as protecting Israel, but many people in the world see what Israel are doing in Gaza and don't see Israel as this inherently good project. There are many criticisms made by post-colonial theorists of Israel. People call it settler colony. So maybe one thing I've heard a lot is that Germany can't help but being on the wrong side of history. And is Germany in danger of damaging its reputation now by standing by Israel, even when Israel is arguably, it would be beneficial to criticize Israel. Maybe Israel needs critical friends as well as supporters.
Yes. So I think there's much to be said to that. Concerning critical friends, I think that the government kind of tries to be just that.
Baerbock,
Baerbock, absolutely. I think that the recent statements of the foreign minister clearly point in that direction. The question is to what extent that is a successful strategy with the current Israeli government. So it really seems that Netanyahu is all in for reasons that are also specific to Israeli domestic politics. And it might not be the most successful strategy for her. So that is one thing. The other thing is that could Germany, in theory, take a different position? As I said, I think that would require a different position on memory culture. It would also require endorsing the pluralism that exists not only in the world as such, but also in Germany already. One of the problems is also that, elites in Germany are still pretty homogeneous. It's mostly, the equivalent of WASPs. It's like Germans with German ancestry, academic parents. Yeah, there's also a social discrepancy here. Probably affiliated with one of the larger Christian churches, or at least in the past affiliated with them. And so there's this kind of ruling class, which I think is very, very strong and also kind of closed in Germany. And
very close and arguably not very good at ruling.
Absolutely. And that, of course, prevents different perspectives from being taken seriously. For example, the perspective of many migrants in Germany who feel oppressed anyway in so many respects and who have a different take on the conflict in the Middle East. For them, it's not just a consequence of the Holocaust, but it's also there's also an
colonial element
of a colonial element in it, absolutely, and which doesn't mean that you have to eliminate Israel, absolutely not. But you have to see that perspective, and we don't see it. And unless you see that perspective, you will hold a position which, even in Germany, many people, particularly those of migrant origin, would consider as a way of marginalizing them even more. And that is why that conflict is so crucial, because it's kind of a litmus test for existing marginalization. Is it going to be increased, going to be entrenched, or are we paddling back? Are we revisiting the factors of that marginalization? So I think you actually have to see that in the context of Germany struggling with, on the one hand, its past, and on the other hand, with its existing plurality that is kind of oppressed.
I have an example of this. About a few days ago, there was an attack on the pages in Lebanon, many of which were associated with the political party movement Hezbollah. In Germany, in the media, there was a lot of applause, especially, from figures like Volker Beck from the German-Israeli Society. Many of them later deleted these tweets, which were, making jokes about people being maimed, about them losing their genitals. And of course, 2 children died in this attack, right? Now, in Germany, there are a few 100,000 Lebanese Germans, some of whom are also Palestinian, right? So is this a case that, like what you're talking about lack of empathy for migrants and, maybe empathy with this idea, this imagined idea of Israelis, of Jews, but forgetting that there are also many other minorities that are related in this conflict?
Yeah. Minorities both here in Germany and in Israel. So absolutely, it's a case of that. And I would say it's not just, a lack of empathy, it's outright racism that we saw. The thing about, making jokes that balls have been blown off and that, whatever, I don't want to repeat it here. That clearly is, kind of reminiscent of racist narratives. And it shows the problems with plurality that pre-exist. And it has prevented, a kind of a reasoned discourse about that. There have been many voices from experts in international law, people that are absolutely unsuspicious of being on the political left have said that there are big problems with this attack because it's indiscriminate. But these voices had a very hard time to get heard in the general public. I mean, some of the quality newspapers took that up, and
you were interviewed in the Legal Tribune Online about this. So, briefly, why would this attack be illegal?
So I think it's illegal because it's an indiscriminate instrument. Under international humanitarian law, one has to respect the principle of distinction in an attack. That means you can only attack someone who is a member of the military of the opposite party. Now we can distinguish international and non-international armed conflicts. That would be that could lead to a very complex position, but that is suffice it to say that even with Hezbollah, you have to make that distinction. And you have to accept or to know that Hezbollah is an organization that started as a militant group, and it obviously has an armed element, an element that is considered as a terrorist group in
By
Europe.
the EU.
But that is not all of Hezbollah. Hezbollah is also a kind of a welfare organization in the territories which it governs. There are certain parts of southern Lebanon and the Bekaa plains where Hezbollah is a quasi-state and where it does many functions, and they cannot be reduced to armed activity. So how do we distinguish that, or how do we make sure that people with pagers were only people involved, let's say, in the military activities of Hezbollah? How can we ensure that even among those involved in military activities were not some that, for example, had the job of medical care, so or were protected persons? There's this category of protected persons within an army. So even within a military group, some people may not be attacked because of their function, which is essentially humanitarian or
like
spiritual,
a medic.
like a medic. And how do we make sure who has the pager? Beyond that, how do we make sure that it's actually the person, that got the pager that still is in possession of it in that very moment? Even if there were orders that they keep that pager, you can't be sure about it. And the fact that you can't be sure about it is a reason for me to say that this is an unacceptable means of warfare. It's a bit like booby traps. There are very few instances where you can think of a booby trap as being legal. They're not completely banned, but I would say the use of them in an indiscriminate way, meaning that you put it at a place where you can't be sure that the next person to come is a soldier and not a child, makes them being banned. And so this would be the, unless you can really control the situation and can be sure that the next person must be a soldier, you can't use them. And it's the same with this pager attack, even though the explosive potential of the pages might not be the same. But that's not the problem. That's a problem of proportionality, which comes after you have made sure that you have got a military target. Yeah, so it violates the principle of distinction.
And what was the German government's response to this attack?
So I only saw the statement by Minister Baerbock, who showed concern about these. She didn't really qualify it as illegal, but at least she said that this is a way of escalating a pending conflict, and I think that's correct, actually.
And one thing with Baerbock, we've seen many statements of concern, but Germany has hardly qualified its support of Israel. Do you think that's the step that they would have to take to get Israel to de-escalate in this? Is that a political impossibility with Scholz as chancellor, or just with the German state as it understands itself, the Staatsräson?
It definitely is very difficult. Still, I think they made some steps. So at least they're currently not delivering certain weapons classified as war weapons. They're delivering other military equipment, smaller numbers, but still. So they have made some concessions here. They've banned certain settlers that were violent or took violent action against Palestinians.
But then Scholz, when he's asked about this, he denies it. That's the bit that's strange. They're taking a humanitarian case and they say, but we're still delivering weapons to Israel.
Yeah. I don't really understand it. It's obviously at odds with with many policies of his party and of the coalition as such. I mean, one of the policies of the Greens in that case has been that no weapons in conflict zones, and it's completely been toppled.
Although arguably they toppled it in Ukraine, and that isn't justifiable.
Right, but then at least you have to show some consistency in that, and I don't see it here.
Well, they could say that Israel is defending itself, right? But maybe, do you think Israel's gone beyond just self-defense in international law?
So the problems that we see are at the level of of international humanitarian law, at in respect of the means of warfare, and there we clearly see excesses. And of course, that happens in every war to some extent, but I think it's quite massive in Gaza. Whether that amounts to an illegal self-defense is a very difficult question. Normally, we tend to see to set apart these things. So even if you use fully illegal means of warfare, it doesn't necessarily make the attack as such illegal if it was only carried out with the right means and in respect of the principle of proportionality.
So, final question, could we use law? Is law the right instrument to stop and to make a ceasefire in Gaza and to stop Israel's human rights violations?
I think it's a necessary but not sufficient instrument. I think it requires political pressure, which in all fairness probably depends on states other than Germany. That doesn't excuse the German government, not at all. But I think you always need both in international relations. You need, an ideational level, and that's international law. You need you need resolutions. You need action by international courts, and to give that some teeth, you also need, political, economic measures that would compel Israel into, or any state. I mean, not just Israel, any state that is not compliant with international law to obey it, and that's not always easy. I mean, we see that in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, in particular if it's a powerful state, of course. Yeah, so international law still is pretty weak, and with declining U.S. power, unfortunately, I'm afraid that it even gets weaker, despite all the problematic positions that the states have taken.
Matthias Goldmann, thanks very much for your time. That was a great conversation.
Thank you very much.
Wow, that was really interesting. If you enjoyed it too, Feel free to hit subscribe and share this on social media or give it a high rating or a thumbs up wherever you listen to your podcasts. This is a completely independent podcast, so we need your support. Thanks very much.